My name is Lori Susskind, and along with Craig Honhauser and the JCC's Manu Nudel Holocaust Learning Center's committee and staff, we are delighted you could join us for our Yom HaShoah commemorative program. Today, we welcome the students and faculty of the David Posnack Jewish Day School, participants from the Institute of Jewish Knowledge and Learning, IJKL, and members of our community to a virtual reality guided tour of the secret Annex in Amsterdam as it appeared from 1942 to 1944 when Anne Frank and 7 others hid from the Nazis. Our personal tour guides today are Morgan and Diana, both from the Anne Frank Center at the University of South Carolina. We ask that you post any questions you may have during the presentation in the Q&A feature, and they will be answered following the tour. In a few short months, we will complete a renovation of the Manu Nudel Holocaust Learning Center at the David Posnack JCC. As part of the center, we are building an Anne Frank Annex, which includes an interactive component as well as a virtual tour similar to what you will see in today's program. Soon, you will be able to bring your friends and family to the Manu Nudel HLC right in your own backyard, so they too will experience the lessons learned from the Holocaust. This state-of-the-art learning center will be the home of the George Gottlieb Holocaust and Jewish Education Program. Our mission is to enrich lives by connecting people through commemoration, education, and inspiration, and by remembering the past in order to build a committed future generation. Today's program is built on that foundation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Morgan.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. We are so happy to be here with you today. Like she said, my name is Morgan Bailey. I work with the Anne Frank Center in partnership with the University of South Carolina and the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. And usually we like to be in person with students like you. I know we have lots of students on the call doing educational activities with traveling exhibits, really fun projects. And of course, over the past year, we have not been able to do that. But the next best thing is being with you in this way. But I do have a request of you. Since we can't be together in person, we would love to interact with you as much as possible. So please send in your questions, leave your comments in the chat, interact with us. We know that we are all feeling a little more isolated than we have been in the past. And so as much as we can connect in this space, we would love to do that with you. So thank you for being here with us today. We're so excited to jump in and show you this really special tour. And I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague, Diana, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Morgan. So yes, hi, welcome everyone. We are so happy that you all are with us. So yes, my name is Diana. I am originally from Hungary and I in the Netherlands in Amsterdam for a couple of years, and I worked for the educational department of the Anne Frank House there. And then last August, I came here to the United States, to South Carolina, and now I work for the Anne Frank Center, the Anne Frank House's partner in the US, and I am also studying at the University of South Carolina. So that's an introduction about me. And now we can start our tour. So we are going to do this tour together with Morgan. And as she said, feel free to ask questions, mainly in the Q&A part of Zoom. We are probably going to answer them when we are finished with the tour, but feel free so that you won't forget to put your questions there while we are doing the tour. So before we jump in, I just would like to give you a little background information about Anne Frank and her family before they had to go into hiding. So in the 1920s in Germany, in Frankfurt, 2 German Jews, Otto Frank and Edith Hollander, they meet, they get married in 1925. A year later, their first daughter, Margot Frank, is born. And 3 years later, in 1929, June the 12th, Anne Frank is born as well. Just a little fact, 1929 was also the year when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born. They both would be 92 years old this year. So the Frank family is complete with the arrival of Anne, and they live again in Germany, Frankfurt. However, at the beginning of the 1930s, when of course they can see that anti-Semitism is on the rise, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler are gaining power, and in 1933 they are elected as the main party, and Hitler gets elected as the Chancellor of Nazi Germany. They decide to escape, to leave Germany. After some consideration to where to go, they were mainly deciding between Switzerland and the Netherlands. They decide to come to the Netherlands in 1933-34 to Amsterdam. That happens because Otto Frank, the father of Anne, he gets a job here. He gets to run a company that's called Opekta. Opekta is a jam making company. I just would like to add that in the diary, Anne had an opinion about that. She said that, I don't think that father has a very nice business. Nothing but pectin and pepper. As long as you're in the food business, why not make candy? Right? I think every kid can relate to that. Anyway, so they end up in Amsterdam. After a while, many or some Jewish friends of ours from Germany also come to the Netherlands. So the girls are also young. They catch on to the Dutch language quite fast. So the family starts to have a relatively carefree life in the Netherlands. They start to make some friends. The kids go to school, etc., etc. However, after the Second World War breaks out in 1939, Nazi Germany occupies the Netherlands in 1940 May, within only 5 days. And the Frank family tries to leave again, because Edith, the mother of Anne, she has 2 elder brothers living in the US. So they try to immigrate to the US. However, at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s, it was very, very hard for Jewish refugees to come to the US. The average waiting time for Jewish refugees to the US was about 11 years. So therefore, they cannot escape anymore. That's why they decide to go into hiding later on. Before they go into hiding, in 1942, for her 13th birthday, Anne gets a diary from her father, which becomes her favorite present. Now, in the first few weeks, she still writes in the diary while she's still outside. However, in 1942, July the 5th, 16-year-old Margot gets a call up for work, which is basically a call up for her to be sent to one of the concentration camps. So from the next day, 1942, July the 6th, because of course the parents are not sending away their 16-year-old daughter alone, the whole family goes into hiding. So that's basically the background, the information of the Frank family before they go into hiding. And now I'm going to hand it over to Morgan so that she can show you where they went into hiding.
All right, thank you, Diana. Now, what you see on your screen now is an aerial shot of Amsterdam. And in blue, you can see the actual building where the Franks were in hiding. Now, the front of this building, like Diana mentioned, was Otto's office space. So Otto was Anne's father, and this was his office. Now, the people working in this building, some of them knew that people were going to go into hiding in this space, and some did not. So it made things complicated as they were planning and preparing, right? Because at this time, hiding Jewish people was considered illegal, and you could be arrested and punished for this. So it was a very big deal to have to be helping someone hide. Now, I love this shot because I think it gives us a really good idea of why it was possible for the 8 people in hiding to stay hidden for just over 2 whole years. Now, first, I have to tell you that there is a common misconception, right, of something around translations. So sometimes this space back here, where they were in hiding, is referred to as an attic. So you may have heard before that Anne Frank hid in an attic. And that can give us the wrong impression sometimes of where they were actually in hiding, because in the US, very often, when we hear the word attic, we think of this space above a house, right? It's that space that's not finished. There's usually no heating or air. It's not insulated. It's usually pretty short. I remember as a kid when I would go in the attic, even then I still had to duck my head. And a lot of people think that that's the kind of space that Anne was in hiding. But actually, there's a better word that we could use to describe this space. And that word is annex. So it wasn't exactly an attic, it was an annex, or a small little building built on the back of another. So in Amsterdam, a lot of the houses were built very narrow, but very long. And the reason for that is because of the taxation practices in the city, right? So you were taxed based on the width of your home. Now, I live just outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and actually there have been similar taxation practices done here. And so in downtown Charleston, if any of you have ever been before, then you may also have noticed that a lot of the buildings are very, very narrow but long, and it's for that exact same reason. So the houses were built often touching each other, right? Narrow but long. And so if you wanted to add on to your space, often the only way to do that was to add to the back of it. So that's where these extra little annexes came from. Now, oftentimes when people hear that they had an extra little house they were hiding in, they say, how in the world could someone be in hiding for 2 whole years and no one have seen them? How did they not get caught, right? Well, and I think one reference that can help us along with this picture is the TV show that some of you may have seen, Full House or Fuller House. Now, depending on your age, you may have watched the original or the remake, or maybe you don't know what either of those are. But in the beginning, it shows row houses in San Francisco that are all touching, right? And so you can see that in this picture here too. If houses are touching, you don't know how deep that house is, right? You don't know how far back it goes. So when you're standing on the street, you have no reason to think there's an extra building in the very back. And if you walk inside, you don't have any sense of depth perception to know how far back that building should go. So that's one reason that this was an ideal hiding place. Now, if you've read the diary, then you have read and talk about listening to the bells of the church next door. And this is the Vesterkerk, or the Western Church. So this is the church that she was referring to when she talked about listening to those church bells. You can see it's very close to where they were hiding. I see lots of questions coming in. Please keep it up. I'm responding to some of them in writing, and then some of them we will incorporate into our tour, and then some we'll save for the end. So send them all in, and we're going to do our best to get to them. Now, before we really get into the meat of the tour, I do want to show you quickly a zoomed in look at this building we just saw highlighted in blue from far away. So here you can see how the annex was built behind the rest of the building. Now, this is important to see because it helps us understand why the Frank family had to be so quiet. If the building's behind the other, then why does it make a big deal if they have to walk quietly or not, right? Well, the reason is because down here you can see that these levels stretched all the way across back into the annex. And so that meant that when the 8 people in hiding were up here, they had to be careful because the people working in the warehouse down here did not know they were in hiding. So I had mentioned that some people who worked here knew, some didn't. The people who knew mainly worked in these offices up front. There were warehouse workers below, the majority of whom had no idea. So they had to be very, very quiet during the day to make sure that no one down below heard them. So what I'm going to do now is hop back over here to the bookcase. Diana is going to give us a little bit more context about who we're talking about today, and then we're going to dive into our tour.
Yes, thank you, Morgan. So, yes, I wanted to just speak a little bit about who are going to be the people in hiding and also their helpers. So, just briefly, because some of these people are already mentioned. So, here we have Otto Frank, the father of Anne, Edith Frank, the mother of Anne, their first daughter, Margot Frank, who is again 16-year-old at the time when they have to go into hiding, and her sister, Anne Frank, who is at this point 13 years old. So they all go into hiding in 1942, July the 6th. About a week later, this other family, the Van Pels family, follows them. Herman Van Pels was Otto Frank's colleague. That's how they got to hide with them at the back of Opekta. So it's Herman Van Pels, his wife, Husti Van Pels, and they had a son, Peter Van Pels, who was about half a year younger than Margot. First, it's these 7 people who live together at the hiding place. And then a couple of months later, in 1942 November, a family friend called Fritz Pfeffer, who is a dentist, he joins them in the hiding place. We are going to tell you a little bit more about the people in hiding later when we are in the actual annex. But here we just wanted to give you like this short visualization about them and their names. So these are the people in hiding. And if we just go a little bit down, we can also see the other very important characters of our story, who are the helpers. Morgan already mentioned them a little bit, that the people in hiding, of course, had helpers as well. So who were these helpers? Well, most of them were also Otto Frank's colleagues at Opekta. So here we have Viktor Küchler and Johannes Kleiman, so 2 colleagues of Otto Frank. Here we have Johann Faskuil, who was the head of the warehouse workers at Opekta. His daughter, Elisabeth, or Bep Faskuil, who was a secretary of Otto. Here we have Miep Hies, who was another secretary of Otto Frank. So all these 5 people were working at Opekta. And here we have Miep's husband, Jan, who was a helper, but he was not working at Otto Frank's company, but he knew about the plan as much as all these other people had. So these people, the helpers, they did a lot to help the people in hiding. They provided them with food, medicine, information, their company, etc., etc. And again, we just wanted to clarify who these people were, and we just wanted to tell you that they are also very much worth remembering. And why? We are going to talk about that again a bit more in details when we go into the annex, which is going to happen right now, because I believe that, Morgan, it is time for us to step into the hiding place.
All right, let's go. So here we are at what we call the landing. So the landing here, I'm going to show you this quick diagram one more time just to remind you, is this connection point, right? So this is the space that connected the rest of the building to the annex. So initially, this connection point just had a door right here. And the thinking at first was, no one really goes back here. It's just the people who know they are in hiding are the ones working in the front of the building. And so no one really goes back there to check. It's not a big deal. But of course, we know that things got progressively worse and worse. And eventually, the Nazis would do searches and they would do raids of buildings looking for all kinds of things. Everything from Jews in hiding to illegal activities. So things like creating fake documents, like fake passports, so that Jewish people could hide their identity, to fake ration cards, and then to everything from bicycles that had not been registered with the government. So these raids were happening regularly, and so it was decided that they needed to conceal this entryway, and that is where this infamous bookcase came from. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I've already shown you how the building works, how it is connected. So why don't we go ahead and walk through the bookcase, and let's see what it looks like when you enter the hiding space. Now, as you could tell from the diagram that I showed you, this is a multi-storied hiding space. So you can see here when you first come through this door, right here, this is the door we just came through. What we are going to do on our tour today is we are going to make a loop of the first floor. So we're going to go through this door and come out of this door. And then we're going to go upstairs. Now, I've seen in the Q&A there are questions about if you can see this space, and you can. So this is now a museum. It's closed because of COVID. But when it opens back up, you can go and you can actually walk through this space. Now, I will tell you, having done that many times, this staircase is very, very steep. So you would want to be very careful on those stairs. I don't have very big feet, but even my feet hang off of the back because the stairs are steep and they are narrow. Even more reason they had to be very careful while they were in hiding. But you are able to go and see this space for yourself in Amsterdam. So now Diana is going to take us into the first and main furnished room of the hiding space.
Yes, thank you again, Morgan. And thank you about that important information about the staircase. That is important.
Very important.
Yes. So voila, we entered the first bedroom of the hiding place, which was the room of Otto, Edith, and Margot. So let's just slowly look around this place. You can see a bed here. This was Edith's bed. Now, above that, you can see several little items. It's quite sad and beautiful at the same time to think about that when you have to go into hiding, you pack your necessities and the things that are the most important for you. And Edith decided to pack her prayer books. Now, Otto wasn't that religious, but Edith was a religious woman, and for her, her Jewish prayer books were very, very important. So that was the door that we came through. Here you can see some books. Here you can see another bed. This was Otto Frank's bed. Margot's bed you cannot see here because she had to sleep in a foldable bed, and during the day they put the foldable bed under this bed. But nevertheless, this was Otto's bed. And whenever Morgan already mentioned the raids that were happening during the Second World War. So whenever a raid happened during those 25 months when the people in hiding had to be there, Anne always got very frightened, and she got up from her bed, got her pillow, and she ran from her room always to her father's bed for comfort. She and Otto, they had a very good relationship. At some point, Anne wrote in her diary that I finally told Daddy that I love him more than I do Mother. Also, to show a little bit proof of that, you can kind of see this briefcase here close to Otto's bed. When Anne was getting a new roommate in the character of Fritz Pfeffer, she was very afraid that maybe he or somebody else would read her diary, and she wanted to keep it safe. So Otto said that, I have this briefcase, you can put all your writings there, and we can keep it during the evenings next to my bed in our room. And this is what they did. And Otto later in an interview said that I promised her, he means Anne, I promised her I would never look in. I never did. So the relationship between Otto and Anne was very special. We know that Edith was also a very devoted mother, but somehow Anne didn't really get this message. They didn't have the best relationship. With Margot, Margot was very, very, very smart. She was the top of her class, and she also loved rowing. After a while, rowing was banned for the Jewish people. She was very sad about that. Two more things I just want to point out here in this room. One is this one. We can go a little bit closer. If you would go to the Anne Frank house today, you would still see this original piece of little map glued to the wall of the room. When in 1944, June the 6th, D-Day happens, which means that the Allies, the Americans, Canadians, and the British land in France, Normandy. Of course, the people in hiding hear about this via the BBC radio from the United Kingdom. And Otto Frank starts to put these pins to the map to keep track of how the Allies are doing, like how fast they are coming, etc., etc. And the other thing I would like to show is quite emotional. When I used to have tours at the Anne Frank house and I had parents as visitors, many of them got emotional here, or they said that this is what they really remember from their visit, because I think many people still nowadays do this, that when their kid or kids grow older, they start to mark their height on a wall or on a paper, a door, and they mark it with pencil, like how fast they are growing. And this is exactly what the Frank parents did with Margot and Anne. Margot grew about 1 centimeter, which is less than half an inch during those 25 months in hiding, but Anne grew 13 centimeters, which is about 5 inches during 2 years and 1 month. Again, if you would go into the Anne Frank house today, you would still see these original marks. And now we can step into the room of Anne Frank and Fritz Pfeffer.
All right, so here we see the bedroom next door. So we just came through this door. And like Diana said, this room was shared by Anne and Fritz Pfeffer. Now, I saw some questions coming in about why Anne wasn't in the room with the rest of her family, or why Anne didn't share a room with Margot. And initially that was the plan. So the Frank family was going into hiding with the Van Pels family. And like I mentioned, this was a 2-story hiding space plus an attic. So the original idea was that the Frank family would share the first floor, the Van Pels family would share the second floor, but on the second floor would also be their communal space. Now, what ended up happening was one of the helpers, Miepkies, she had a dentist, and this dentist was Jewish, and he knew that she was a good, upstanding, trustworthy woman, and he said, Miep, I am afraid because I am Jewish, but I'm also in a relationship, a romantic relationship with someone who is not Jewish. Her name was Charlotte. And this, he thought, put kind of a bullseye on his chest that he was going to be arrested. And it is true, it was illegal to be in this relationship. And so he said, I know I need to go into hiding, but I don't have anywhere to go, or I don't know who can help me. Do you have any connections that you can help? And she said, I'll see what I can do. So she came back to the people in hiding and she shared this information. And the response generally, especially from Otto, was, if we can feed 7, we can feed 8. And so they took him in. But then the question, of course, was, where is he going to sleep? So one thing that's important for us to keep in mind when we hear stories from the Holocaust, I saw someone in the chat said their grandparents have stories from the Holocaust, is this idea of choiceless choices. So it means that sometimes they had to make decisions where there was no easy answer. You were stuck between a rock and a hard place, if you will, right? And you just have to do the best you can. And so this was kind of one of those situations. So it was decided that Fritz would move in and share this room with Anne, mainly because, like Diana said, Anne was younger. She was 13 years old, and she was viewed as the baby. She was the baby of her family, but everyone kind of saw her as this little girl. She was still playful and had that youthful energy. Now, of course, one thing we do know is that after Otto Frank later read the diary, he realized that Anne was much more mature than he realized. But at the time when they're making these decisions, Anne was seen as just a little girl. And so it was decided that it made more sense for Anne to share this space with Fritz Pfeffer because she was a little girl in the eyes of her family, whereas Margot was 16. She was a teenager. And so they felt that it made the most sense to move the teenager into the room with the parents and let the little girl stay in the room with Fritz Pfeffer. Now, this was not easy. This was not an easy relationship. Anne writes in her diary about getting frustrated with Fritz. She actually talks pretty poorly about him. But to be honest, that's just because Anne was really honest in her diary. She, as she was writing it, didn't expect for most of the time she was writing that anyone would ever see it. And so she was very honest. And it's really tough. I can't imagine as a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old having to share a space with 8 people that is so small, but also having to share this bedroom with a grown man that you don't relate to at all. So she wrote about her feelings about him, and she expresses her frustration very honestly. But we actually do know Fritz Pfeffer was a very good man because of testimonies that have come out later. He had a son that survived that shared that, you know, he had a lot of really good qualities that Anne didn't see, of course, because she was just a young girl. But this was really tough for them to share this room together. Anne, like I mentioned, was way more mature than a lot of them realized. And she felt that she was very mature, and she felt that she deserved to be treated with respect, which of course she did. But she writes about how her and Fritz Pfeffer fought over this desk. You can see her diary here, some papers, other notebooks. And Fritz was a dentist, like I mentioned, and so he liked to take time during the day to write letters to Charlotte, his love, and to keep up to date on all the latest dentistry practices and studies. And so he wanted to use the desk, but of course Anne wanted to use the desk to write in her diary. And so there was a lot of tension over who got to use the desk. And eventually they had to come up with a schedule. One of them used it for certain hours and the other got to use it for certain hours. Now, Diana mentioned that Anne grew a lot during this time, and you can actually see this chair here at the end of her bed, and it's there because she outgrew her bed and her feet were hanging off. So they put this chair here so she would have somewhere to set her feet at night. Now, something else about this room that's really special are the pictures on the wall. I saw someone shared in the chat that they had been to the Anne Frank house, I think 3 years ago. And if you were to go and see it today, you would still see most of these pictures on the wall. I say most because today they're covered by glass plates, but initially when tour groups would come in, some people thought it would be cool to take a souvenir, and they actually took some of the pictures off of the wall to take home with them. So that's why they had to cover them to keep them safe, because today it's really special that you can actually go in and see the photos from magazines, primarily, that Anne chose to decorate her room. Now, we can see evidence of Anne growing up in the diary, but we can also see it through these pictures. So it's pretty cool because one thing that was discovered was that a photo, a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci was on the wall, and it was found that underneath it was a picture from a magazine that Anne describes in her diary as a childish print. So we can see that when she first moved into the space, she had certain preferences, certain tastes that she liked. And then as she grew older, her taste changed and she covered up some of those pictures. I remember as a kid having posters on my wall and then taking them down and putting up new ones. one last look at this room. And then we are going to go next door. Diana is going to show us the last room on this floor.
Yes, thank you. At the same time, I managed to answer, I think, many questions in the chat. Some I didn't answer because we are going to cover them during the tour, but I am so very proud of all of you because you just keep bumping us with questions, and that's great. Actually, we are not going to spend a lot of time in this room because it is very small, and this was their bathroom. So this was the door from Anne and Fritz Pfeffer's room. Here you can see that they had a toilet, which they couldn't use during the weekdays from about 8 a.m. until about 5 p.m. because they were afraid that the warehouse workers who didn't know about the plan, they would hear it that how come in this building, the office workers above us are going to the bathroom like 30 times during the day, because of course the warehouse workers didn't know that anybody was hiding there. So they would have gotten suspicious if they would have heard how many times the water is flushing. So the people in hiding actually couldn't use that bathroom for the majority of the day on the weekdays. On the weekends, they were a little bit more free with that because on the weekends, of course, nobody was working in the Opekta. And here you can see that they had a sink. This is quite a small bathroom. You might have noticed that they didn't have a bath. They had a portable bath that they brought down during the weekend or during the evenings to the offices below them to take a bath there. So yes, there you go. One more time, the toilet. So this was their bathroom. And if we go out this door, you may recognize this place. We already saw this when we came through the bookcase. I'm not sure if it was mentioned that the bookcase was built up by one of the helpers by his own hands, Johan Faskuil, who was the head of the warehouse workers. So actually the bookcase was made by one of the helpers. I just wanted to say that. And we finished the first floor of the hiding place. So we are back at the very steep staircase, and Morgan is going to show us, we are going to go up these stairs, and Morgan is going to show us the first room of the second floor of the hiding place.
All right, thanks, Diana. So I mentioned earlier that the initial plan was for one story of the hiding place to be where the Frank family slept and the other to be where the Van Pels family slept, in addition to their common area. So this is the room that was the common area. You can see beds in the background. And then you can see a kitchen table. You can see everything that was needed for a kitchen here to prepare food. Now, I've seen lots of questions coming in about the helpers and what they did and how the people in hiding were able to honestly survive, get food, get clothes, and it really cannot be overstated how important the helpers are in this story. As a matter of fact, there is a fantastic book by Miep Hees. She was one of the helpers, where she shares her perspectives on this time period. And it is so incredibly moving because when we think about this time, we think about what it was like to be in hiding. And of course, we can't imagine the stress and the emotional and mental toll that it took on all of them. But sometimes we forget about what a toll it took on the helpers as well. So that is a book that I highly recommend. I mentioned earlier that the illegal activities that were being searched for during raids included things like looking for rations. So in the US, when we think of rations, we usually think of the Great Depression and a time when there were ration cards to buy necessary goods that they were afraid would run out. And that's exactly what this was at the same time happening here, right? So it's the same kind of ration cards, and it means that every person and every family is allocated a certain amount of goods that they are able to buy, which is fine as long as you are only trying to feed the people that the government knows are being fed in your household. But for someone like Neep Heath and her husband Jan, it was just the two of them. So they were only allocated ration cards for them. But then they also had to get food somehow for all these people in hiding. So it was a very big undertaking to find these fake cards, to find people who would sell them food and maybe turn an eye sometimes at the quantity that they were requesting. So when we think about helpers and we think about people who were able to really take care of people who needed it, there's so many types of helpers and so many people who had a role in making this possible. Sometimes we limit it to the initial people that Diana introduced us to earlier, but we also have to remember that there were other people involved as well. So there was a couple who ran a vegetable stand, and when the helpers would come to buy vegetables, oftentimes, you know, they had a suspicion that maybe they were trying to help people. And so sometimes they would just sneak extra vegetables and put them in the bags, even though maybe they didn't pay for it, or maybe they didn't have the rations, they would still give them extra food. And it was actually discovered later that that couple was hiding Jews themselves and ended up being arrested for it. So there were helpers at every level of this story, right? And so helpers had to do things like bring food. Now, I saw someone ask how the helpers were not suspicious, why they didn't look suspicious going in and out of the annex, right? And so I will bring this up again to show us here. These were their offices. So the people working here knew about the people in hiding, right? And so if one of them saw the other go through the bookcase, then of course they knew what was going on. Now, they did try not to do that during the workday because you never knew if someone might come upstairs. But what they often had to do was do their grocery shopping and then go into their offices and tuck the food bags away so it wasn't obvious. And then when possible, they would sneak into the annex and deliver that. So that's food. Someone was asking about what kinds of things they ate. It was hard to get delicacies, right? So delicacies being things like meat or sweets and desserts, alcohol, cigarettes, these kinds of things. They were able to store in the attic space beans and certain vegetables. They had a lot of kale at the end that Anne complains about. They really never expected to be in hiding as long as they were. So while they were able to really store up a good bit of food, towards the end, if you've read Anne's diary, she talks about how, especially during really, really harsh winters when it was hard for anyone to get food, she talks about how tired she was of having kale soup with some onion for dinner, right? And potatoes, always, always, always potatoes. She would get tired of that. Now, while she would get tired of this, like any of us would, at the same time, and also acknowledge that she was very fortunate because she had things like a kitchen and she had a bathroom and she had the ability to be with her family all together that otherwise most people in hiding did not have those luxuries. So Anne was able to recognize that it was a very challenging time and a challenging situation, but she was also very fortunate to have the things that she did and even the food she did, even if it was nasty kale. So the next room we're going to look at is Peter's bedroom. Before we hop over, I want to point out this board game here. It was like a stock exchange game. I've been told it's like an early European version of Monopoly. Peter got that for a birthday, and it was a source of entertainment. And it's actually still at the Anne Frank house. You can see that when you go. So Diana is going to show us the next room.
Exactly. And surprise, the next room is also, again, a quite small room. We arrived to Peter's bedroom. Peter was the only one who had a room of his own. This was his bed. And when Peter arrives to the hiding place, Anne writes about him in her diary. And she says that Peter is a shy, awkward boy whose company won't amount to too much. Fast forward to 1944, April, they shared their first kiss together here on Peter's bed. So obviously her opinion changed about Peter. So this was the door to the dining room. And you can see, well, the reason why he was of course very fortunate to get a room on his own, but you can see why it takes us very little time to go through this room. We are already back to the bed because it was quite a very, very small room. This was Peter's bicycle. And we are almost at the end of our tour. I'm just going to give you a little bit more time to look around here because this ladder is going to take us to the last room of our tour, which is going to be the attic, which was Anne's favorite place, by the way. However, again, as I said, just wanna give you one more look of Peter's small bedroom. Peter had a cat whom he could bring with himself, Mushi, and Mushi lived here together with Peter. All right, Morgan, are you ready to show us the last place of the tour?
I am. So we're going to look at this very quickly and then take the rest of our time to answer even more of your fabulous questions. So this is the attic space. A couple of frequently asked questions here. Why did no one stay up here? Well, it wasn't insulated. So that means that in the winters, it got very, very cold. In the summers, it got very, very hot. And there were also some rodents up here occasionally. Anne loved it up here. This was the only space that she could truly be alone. She could look out of this window and see the chestnut tree. She didn't really care so much for nature initially, but after coming into hiding and not being able to go outside, she really appreciated nature, being able to look out of this window, see the sky, and see the tree. Now, the tree actually got a disease, and then in a storm, it fell over, it did not make it, the tree died, but they were able to, from the tree, create some saplings. And these saplings, or baby trees, have been planted in Anne Frank memorials or museums or special places in countries all over the world. And there are several here in the US actually. So you can see the second generation of the Anne Frank tree, as it is often called. Now, this was a special place to Anne. I want to make sure we see this. This is where a lot of the food was stored that I mentioned earlier. But for now, I think it is time for us to stop sharing and answer some of your questions. Now, there are so many questions. There are a lot of repeats, but yes. I want to start with the most common question.
I just thought maybe I would wrap it up a little.
Oh, yes, please.
Like what? So because again, I think maybe we wanted to say the same thing. One of the most commonly asked questions really ties into this is like, okay, they were in hiding for 2 years and 1 month, but what happened after? Well, in 1944, August the 4th, around 10:30 in the morning, a police car stops in front of Opekta, and the police, they go to the company and they find the hiding place. Now, it is quite probable that the people in hiding were betrayed. Somebody figured out that they were hiding there and that somebody phoned the police on that day. However, who that person was is really not clear. We have many theories. We have a theory that one of the warehouse workers figured out that people were hiding at Opekta. We have a theory that the cleaning lady of Opekta figured it out. We have a theory that the neighbors must have heard something. We have a theory that one of the helpers, Bab's sister, was sympathizing with the Nazi idea. Maybe she figured out that her sister is helping someone. There was a theory that there was a Jewish woman who was working around that block, who made a deal with the Nazis that if they don't send her to the camps, she would report other Jewish people in hiding. And for instance, we know that that woman did exist, and she reported more than 100 people in hiding. Now, I believe I just told you about 5 theories. There are more. There are so many theories. One is more legit than the other, but the truth is that we don't know who betrayed the people in hiding. About the helpers, 2 of them are taken away with the people in hiding, namely Viktor Küchler and Johannes Kleiman, but they both survive. So all the helpers, all 6 of them, survive the Second World War period. It is actually, by the way, Miep Heath and Beb, so the 2 female colleagues of Otto Frank, whom after the arrest find Anne's diaries and papers and notebooks in the floor of the hiding place. They collect them and they put them to Miep's desk drawer in her office. And Miep said that she wanted to give it back to Anne when she returns. Now, that never happened. I also saw questions about that. So the people in hiding, after discovered, they are taken to various concentration camps. And what happens to Margot and Anne is that they end up in the concentration camp Bergen, Belsen, which is in the northwest part of Germany. And they both die there in 1945, February, about 6 weeks because of the liberation of the, before the liberation of the camp. And the only survivor of the 8 people in hiding is Otto Frank. He gets liberated by the Russian army in 1945, January the 27th in Auschwitz, which is now, because of this event, is the International Holocaust Memorial Day. So Otto Frank survives since they realize after a while that Anne and Margot won't come back. Miep gives Otto the diary. Otto publishes it first, of course, in Dutch, because that was the language that the diary was written in. He publishes it in the Netherlands in Dutch in 1947. Then Otto goes to live with 2 of his helpers, Miep and Jan, the couple, for about 7 years, because Otto doesn't have his home anymore either. Then he remarries to another Holocaust survivor. They don't have children together, and they move to Switzerland, Basel, where Otto Frank dies in 1980 at the age of 91. And the Anne Frank house is opened by him and, of course, by other supporters of him in 1960, May. And it has been open ever since until the coronavirus pandemic. Now about 1.2 million people visit the house every year. So that's the whole story. I think with that I answered many questions, but Morgan, I'm going to give it back to you now.
Yes, you answered so many questions, and there are so many that I can't even go through and acknowledge all of them. But thank you, Diana, for that overview. Another common question that I see coming up is about versions of the diary. And this is a common question that, that we get. And there had been rumors, you may have heard, about different versions of the diary. There was even a rumor at one point that Otto Frank wrote the diary himself, that it wasn't Anne that wrote it. And he actually went to court to get it officially proven the diary was written by Anne. They were able to take her school papers from before they went into hiding from teachers and compare that to the handwriting, and they had experts confirm in a court of law that she did write the diary. Now, the reason that this honestly conspiracy theory came about is because there have been different versions of the diary published for a few reasons. Now, initially, like Diana said, after Otto returned back to the Netherlands, he actually lived with Miep and Jahis for a little while, and Miep gave him the diary after finding out that Anne would not come home. And when he was eventually able to read it, I mentioned before that Anne was very honest in her diary, and she wrote about how she felt, and she wrote about fights with her mom and what she truly thought of her mom, and that she said her mom was a role model of how she did not ever want to become, and some other things that to Otto, that was his wife. And so it was very hurtful for him to imagine people all over the world reading these things about his wife who had passed away and been murdered, right? And so he made the decision to remove that and not have this published about his wife. And also wrote about her changing body. And today, that's something very normal for books to include. But back in the 1940s, it was not something that was often included in books that were published for a wide audience. And so he also kept things out about her body that she wrote. And so initially, this is what was published. And then later on, all of that information was added back. And so that is why you will hear people say that there are different versions of the diary. That is the case. But if you have read the diary within the past like 30 years, then you have likely read the version that has everything included. Diana, did you have a question you wanted to answer?
Well, I wanted to say that I can see that we are almost out of time. So I put down, first of all, I put down my email address to the chat. So if anyone would like to write to me about their specific questions or about anything, feel free to write to me. I will answer to all of your questions. And I would also like to say that I have time to stay longer to answer more questions. So yeah, I just wanted to say that I can stay longer. I am not sure about you, Morgan, or about the organizers, if that would be okay, but I just wanted to share this.
I've also dropped the email address education@annefrank. That should be .com. I'm sorry, I was typing too quickly. This is these kinds of programs we love. We love connecting with different partners and organizations, and we can do this kind of tour for classrooms as well. So if you're a teacher or a principal, or you know someone who works in a school, we would love to connect and do virtual programs, but also in person when we're able to travel. We are excited to get down to Florida in person, hopefully before too long, and about this exciting new exhibition that's opening. And so we would love to connect with some of you in person as well. So I'm not sure if our coordinators want to let us go any longer and answer more questions or not, but Diana and I are both here and able to answer more if there's time. Otherwise, we'll hand it back over to y'all.
We can go a little bit longer if you want to answer a couple more questions.
All right, Diana, is there one you saw you wanted to answer?
First of all, somebody said that we don't see Diana's email. I just put it to the chat again. Can you see now?
That's only to the panelists. So you have to change who you're sending it to and make it to all attendees.
I am sorry. Okay, then I'm just going to do it again. I think it should be fine now. Okay, thank you. So I was getting a few questions that were really specific, but like, okay, but what exactly happened to Peter? What exactly happened to Edith, etc., etc. So I think I'm going to answer that because many people were asking that.
We want to let them go, like,
so what exactly happened is that the 8 people in hiding, after they arrested, they are taken to a prison in Amsterdam for a few days. Then they are taken to a transit camp still in the Netherlands. They stay there for a few weeks, and then at the beginning of September 1944, they are transported by a train, by the last train to ever leave that transit camp to Auschwitz. After a few days in that train, they arrive to Auschwitz and they are all selected for work. However, that is when their luck completely runs out. The first one to go is Mr. Van Pels, because he's selected for work, but he hurts his hand, so he's gassed in one of the gas chambers in Auschwitz in 44 October. Around the same time, Anne, Margot, and Herman Van Pels's wife, Küsti, they are taken by train to the concentration camp Bergen, Belsen. Now, Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist, is taken to another concentration camp called Neuengamme, which is not far from Bergen, Belsen, and he dies there at the end of.
So he was like happy. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I think
It was us.
I'm sorry, you're not muted. Can you please maybe mute yourself? Thank you.
Right, we're good.
So Fritz Pfeffer is transferred to Neuengamme, and he dies there because of the bad conditions and because of exhaustion at the end of 44, so in December. Edith Frank, he remains in Auschwitz, and he dies on the 6th of January 1945 because of starvation in Auschwitz, about 3 weeks before the liberation of the camp. And then first Margot dies in 1945, February, I might add around her 19th birthday, because of an illness called typhus in Bergen-Belsen. And then half a day later or 1 day later, we are not sure, Anne dies because of typhus as well. Küsti Van Pels is transferred to Buchenwald and then to Theresienstadt, which is in the Czech Republic, and we are not sure if she dies already on the train ride or in the Theresienstadt camp, but she dies in 44 April. And what happens to Peter? Well, when the Russian army is close to Auschwitz, they start to march all the Jewish people. The Nazis start to march all the Jewish people who can still walk more to the heart of the occupied territories. That's what they do with Peter. So they march Peter by foot to Mauthausen, which is in Austria, which is an incredibly long trip. And he actually makes the trip, and he was probably liberated in Mauthausen, but his health was so far gone that the liberators couldn't really help him. So he dies in 1945, May, there in Mauthausen. He's about 18 year old at that time. And as I mentioned, Otto Frank is the only survivor of the 8 people in hiding.
Thanks, Diana. Let's see. So one common question is about how do we know all of this? Like where does this information come from? How do we even know that this is what the annex looked like and that the furniture was like this? Someone was asking how we even know this is the right place if they raided lots of different buildings. And a lot of it comes back to Otto Frank. Like Diana said, he survived. And so he was able to come back. And eventually, after the war, the building, his office space and the annex were supposed to be torn down and demolished. And initially, Otto didn't really know what he wanted to do with this space. He felt like he wanted to do something, but wasn't sure if that was going to look like a museum or if people would want to even come see this space. But he knew he didn't want it to be torn down. And so he, along with some friends, were able to fundraise and find the money to purchase this building and save it. And then it eventually, of course, has turned into the museum. It's also kind of a memorial and educational center that it is today. But Otto was involved with that from the very beginning. And so he was able to share the stories of what their daily lives were like. Also, the helpers were able to do that because they survived as well. And so they were able to share all of their experiences, write them down, write it in a book like Miep did. And so that's how we know what the space actually looked like. Now, what you saw today was virtual reality. So these were not actual photos taken in the space. It was recreations based on the descriptions that we know from Otto and then the helpers as well. And so that's what we just saw. And this is actually a really unique look at this space, because if you go in person, all of these rooms are empty. There's no furniture in them. And the reason for that is because all of the furniture after the arrest happened was stolen. A company came and took it all away, and they it was left that way until the end of the war. And so when Otto came back and he entered this space, he found it completely empty. And so he said that he wanted to make sure that the this space remained as it was when he found it. So he basically said that he knew that one day everywhere in Amsterdam and the Netherlands and Europe was going to move on from this history, but he wanted there to be one space that kind of remained frozen in time. And so the Anne Frank House is that memorial space today that you walk through. It is silent and it is empty. So with that, I will leave you and hand it back to our fabulous hosts.
Thank you, Morgan and Diana. This was beyond words, beyond wonderful. We are so grateful for the time you took in this incredible tour and to a wonderful audience. This Anne Frank House is really something wonderful for us, and something that you're going to be able to experience in the Manu Dell Holocaust Learning Center. Anne Frank, her story and her life are emblematic of our understanding of the Holocaust. While recent studies indicate that many millennials and Gen Zers' knowledge of the Holocaust is limited, most know or have heard of Anne Frank. It is in her memory that we conclude today's Yom HaShoah program with her most well-quoted message: "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." And on behalf of the David Posnack JCC, thank you all so much for joining us today. And Morgan and Diana, we are really grateful. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you all so much. This was really special. Thanks for all your questions.
We're going to see you in Florida.
Yes, can't wait.
Yes.
All right.